There are some great lessons in life. Two of my favourites are never judge a book by its cover and don't believe everything you see or hear on the internet. So how on earth does this relate to a Porsche engine? Let me explain. Maintaining and working on the engine that's stuck in under there is dead simple. It's every bit as simple as this, and this is pretty simple to work on. And it's miles easier than this. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Because you take one look at the engine jammed in there and think that's got to be hard work. And also, I'm sure you've seen reviews online where they talk about how the engine in the middle makes it fantastic for handling, but your worst nightmare for maintenance. I truly wonder if the people making statements about how hard it is to maintain that engine in there have ever actually touched one. Because to be honest, it's wrong. And not just a little bit wrong, it's completely wrong. So why am I so sure of this? Well, I'm that bloke who bought two 981 Boxsters, one to drive and another just to strip down for fun and make a library of videos of pretty much every maintenance procedure there is on this car. I learned a lot, but what was one of the biggest lessons? Working on this engine with it stuck in here is just plain easy. Not because it's stuck in the middle of the car, but because of what Porsche have done under there is completely different to anything else I've ever worked on. I've never worked on other mid-engine cars like Ferrari, Lamborghini or McLaren, so I can't make comment on them. But believe me, there are some seriously large-brained individuals in the Porsche engineering and design department when they can make this so simple. It's genius. So, if you like working on your own car or just are interested in how well-designed machines are put together, stick around and I'll explain. Don't worry. It won't be pitched at an expert level, so hopefully anyone who is interested will get what I'm talking about. The basic problem of engine maintenance is one of accessibility to components. Think of an engine as a cube. It doesn't have one side, it has 6. This cube, the engine, is then placed in a box, the engine bay, with limited space for access between the two. I can open the top of the box, the hood, and get access to the top of the engine, but this doesn't give me access to everything. Depending on how the engine is constructed, you might at times need to get access to any one or more of all these 6 sides of the engine. Often the components you are working on are hard to get access to, like the yellow part here. This will most likely be sitting underneath other components. Not only do I need to get my hands on it, but I need to get tools down there as well. The effort the designers have gone to manage this problem of the engine shape relative to the engine bay, tool accessibility, how those components are overlaid, their ease of removal, and if they're fragile and might break when removed will all make a huge difference to the difficulty and cost of the task. And to make matters worse, some engine bays are made for more than one engine shape to be installed. Like this X5 for example, this is installed with a straight 6 twin turbo diesel engine, which is narrow and long. These cars are also fitted with a V8, which is shorter but much wider and a completely different shape. This makes the job of designing the engine, how it's mounted, to allow for maintenance even harder. So if the car manufacturer hasn't put a lot of thought into this, the maintenance is difficult, prone to breakage of other parts, time consuming, expensive, and quite frankly, just a very frustrating experience. So what do Porsche do? Well, they put far more thought into this than any other manufacturer I've seen. But prior to getting to that, let's talk at a basic level about how engines and transmissions are mounted in cars. Please excuse my basic models. The production budget for this video is, well, 0, but you've probably worked that out already. Here we have an engine and transmission, and these will be always bolted together. To mount this in the front of the car, this is traditionally done by using a subframe, which is a big metal brace that sits underneath. To mount the transmission, there is normally a second smaller subframe to support it. There will be rubber mounts on each to support the engine and the transmission. In addition, there will be other items connected to the subframe like the steering rack and suspension arms. Also, in some high performance cars, there might be some reinforcing attached to stiffen the chassis. In the past, the front subframe has been relatively small, like a single bar here, but over time in a lot of modern cars, these have grown to be much more substantial to cater for increasing car performance and also to make cars stiffer.
The engine and transmission then sit above this on the rubber mounts, and then this whole assembly is then bolted up onto the bottom of the car chassis, with the transmission output drive shaft coming out of the back to the wheels at the rear. If the car is front-wheel drive, this whole thing is pushed forward so the drive shafts come out of the transmission to the front wheels like this. We call this a north-south design. Or the whole thing is rotated through 90 degrees and the drive shafts come out like this to the wheels. This is referred to as east-west and is the way most small front-wheel drive cars are designed. Regardless of the particulars of the design, the whole thing will be sitting on the subframe. So let's go back to the rear-wheel drive design to make things simple. As you can see, the result of this is the whole thing gets super busy. Everything's jammed in there like a sardine can, and getting access to many items can be a nightmare. If I do need to get access to anything from underneath for maintenance, which is often the case, I have to either work around this or support the engine from above and lower or remove the subframe to do the work. If you've never worked on a car, believe me when I say that this is a lot of effort, especially with modern subframes that are increasingly large. So before we go to the Porsche, let's look at what this traditional design looks like on an actual car. This is the underside of my E46 BMW. This is the reinforcement plate, which I'll remove, and then you can see the subframe, which is a single bar underneath. Here is where the engine mounts, the suspension connections and steering, and it's bolted to the chassis here. Getting access to this stuff isn't so bad on this car. If we move back to the transmission, we can see where it's mounted, and because of the shape of the tunnel, we have good access to the bottom of the transmission, but the rest is pretty difficult to get at. But in something like this BMW X5, which is pretty typical of a modern SUV, I'll remove the reinforcing. The subframe is huge and covers up so much here that getting access to many items is close to impossible. For a lot of maintenance procedures, you will need to support the engine from above and lower the subframe to do the work. All this means a lot of work and pain on your weekend when you'd rather be sitting by the pool having a beer with your mates. Or it means a more expensive and difficult repair if you're paying a mechanic. So how do Porsche mount an engine and transmission in their sports cars? Firstly, let's move the engine back to where it's located in the Cayman or Boxster. The first thing you'll notice is that all those components that were jammed together in one place have now been spread out over the length of the car. In addition to this, and the thing that makes the really big difference, is that Porsche don't use subframes underneath to support either the engine or transmission. What they do is have 3 mounts in total, 1 at the front and 2 at the rear, and these are all mounted at the sides rather than underneath. So in the Cayman or Boxster with the engine at the front, there is a single mount here on the front of the engine that gets bolted directly up onto the chassis, and the transmission has a mount on either side that is connected to brackets that are in turn bolted up onto the chassis. So why do they do it this way? The reason is to lower the engine and transmission as much as possible to lower the centre of gravity, as the engine and transmission are now much lower in the car. In fact, it sits so low that the engine pan is nearly the low point of the car. The great thing is this also has the added benefit of having the entire underside of the engine and transmission completely open, which gives excellent access for maintenance. They are also taking advantage of there being more room at the back due to the smaller wheel arches, as the front wheel arches always need to be larger so you can steer the wheels. Also, unlike many other cars, there will only be one engine shape ever go into the Porsche engine bay. Even though the available engines have different capacities, their dimensions are identical, making development of the engine and how it's mounted far simpler. In the 911, where the engine and transmission are flipped around, this triple mount arrangement is the same. The single mount is still at the front, which means it's at the end of the transmission, and the 2 rear mounts come from a big bracket that is bolted to the end of the engine. So what does all of this look like in the car? So this is under the Boxster. For orientation, this is the front of the car. The engine and transmission are here. The engine mount is up the front behind these coolant pipes, and the transmission mounts are back here. As you can see, the underside of the engine is really clear. There's a bunch of reinforcing like in the BMWs that only takes a few minutes to remove, And once you do that, you can see that access is infinitely better than either of the other cars. Whilst all that sounds great, I'm sure you're saying, but access to the top is shocking. Don't worry, I'll get to that. Like I showed earlier, one of the great things about having the engine down the back is now at the front of the car, you can see the front subframe that supports the steering gear and the suspension arms. So these components have now been spread out over the length of the car rather than being jammed into one place like we saw on the front engine car. This spreading out of components and the way Porsche have mounted the engine and transmission makes it far easier to get access to components. Clearly, you need to get access to more than just the underside of the engine. Side access is easy with the wheels removed if you need to do spark plug changes, for example. Access to the front of the engine is also easy. You just pull out the carpet, remove the screws on the cover, and then you have easy access. Whilst it looks like the engine is jammed in there, the dimensions are such that there is enough room to do any maintenance task you want. Porsche have checked all of this. Of note, the only scheduled maintenance that requires access here is changing the accessory belt, which is done every 90,000 kilometres. The top of the engine is a little bit more difficult to get access to, especially if a Boxster, as the convertible roof sits above it. The Cayman is pretty simple, as you just lift the tailgate, take off some carpet and trim, and then remove the top engine cover, and then you have access. In the Boxster, you can either put the roof into a service position, which sits the roof about here, so you get limited access. This takes about 15 minutes. Personally, I prefer to remove the roof entirely like you see here. It's not particularly difficult and it takes about 30 minutes total. The roof is surprisingly lightweight. My wife, who is in her 50s and 5'3", is easily able to lift one side out while I lift the other. Whilst this does seem like a lot of effort, it's been designed so there is no scheduled maintenance that requires you to ever get access to the top of the engine. All scheduled maintenance is done from under the car where access is easy. So unless you're doing some significant maintenance, you never need access to the top of the engine like you see here. The only real downside is that you always have to lift up the car. If you're fortunate enough to have a lift, that's great, but putting it up on jack stands only takes a few minutes. Overall though, access is dead simple, and I'd take it over any of those others we've looked at in a heartbeat, especially the SUV. When it comes to removing parts and access, Porsche put so much more effort into making things as easy as possible compared to others. Honestly, some of the stuff I've seen on other cars makes me think that for some manufacturers, it's barely a consideration. Looking at the engine bay, it looks like a shocker at the top to get access to things beneath, like the alternator and other ancillaries, because of the intake manifold that sits over the top of it. But unlike other intake manifolds, it's made up of 3 smaller parts rather than one huge manifold. The center section is joined to the outer parts by these big clamps and a seal underneath. A single screw releases each clamp, you pull the seal underneath to the side, and then the center section comes out easily and you immediately get access to what is below. You could do this 100 times without issue. No seals need replacing and everything is well made and strong so things don't break. Removing either intake runner at the side is then dead simple if required. Here's another really simple example. This is the oil separator for the crankcase ventilation system, which will need to be replaced as the car ages. The screws that hold it in place are all the way down the bottom, so it looks like a shocker to get access to. But the attachment screws are put in at a funny angle, which as it turns out are exactly right so you can get a socket and extension perfectly onto it through the gap in the manifold. Use a magnetic tool to fish out the screw and there you have it. The thing is, the entire car is like this. Every single bit, every bolt placement and every gap to remove a component has clearly been checked extensively. I hate to go on about it, but from a wrench turning perspective, it's automotive nirvana. I often see videos slagging off at German engineering. Well, they can't have been talking about one of these. There have been some pretty dreadful examples, but this Porsche is in a different league. When I was making all the maintenance videos and I was finding a task difficult, I realised that I just needed to work out exactly what the design engineer had in mind. Once I'd worked it out, I had a good laugh at how stupid I was, and then I just got on with the task, which was generally very easy. This Porsche design philosophy makes doing maintenance so simple compared to other car makes. So you're probably thinking, why don't other car brands go to this effort? And the reason is because it costs money and time to design it like this. If you've ever bought a Porsche sports car, You probably didn't realize it at the time, but this design philosophy is one of the things you are paying for when you wrote a big check in the first place. You might also be asking why maintenance on this stuff is so expensive when it's been made so simple to do. The fact is, it's different, really different to any other car. It's not put together like a Camry, and unless your mechanic is familiar, they won't want to touch it with a stick, as the risk of a very expensive screw-up is high. They will simply tell you to take it to the Porsche dealership, where they will happily empty your wallet for vehicle maintenance that the motoring public thinks is rocket science. But, thanks to the Porsche design engineers, it's actually child's play. If you're still here, thanks for watching the whole thing. I hope you got something from it. YouTube will now suggest a couple of videos for you. There'll be one down here, which is one I posted recently on how the 911 Boxster and Cayman are pretty much exactly the same car under the surface, and also how the 911 is probably going to be less expensive to produce. But if you're not interested in that, there'll be one down here, which is a suggestion of something else from YouTube. Happy driving, and thanks again. Cheers.